Hello everyone, welcome back to Dragon Ball Dissection. As I said last time, we are briefly taking a break from the manga, this time covering the first arc of the Dragon Ball television series. But don't they have the same story, you ask? Yes, but with any adaptation to a different medium, there are changes. If not, then geeks like us wouldn't spend so many hours debating over whether or not the newest superhero movie totally ruined the backstory of Insert Power Here Man. The TV version of Dragon Ball really doesn't deviate too terribly much from its source. Perhaps the most notable change is that it split Dragon Ball into two separate series. But aside from that, TV Dragon Ball is most notorious for adding material. The anime was being made and broadcast at the same time the manga was being serialized, and at the same rate of one installment per week. Because a half-hour TV series can easily cover more material than a 15-page manga chapter, it became inevitable that the writers of the TV series would have to produce additional material. At their best, these filler segments filled in parts of the storyline that Toriyama glossed over. They allowed us to catch glimpses of what other characters, who might not be the central focus at that moment, were doing or thinking during crucial points. They gave us a taste of what characters were doing during time skips. At their worst, they built up pointless gags around exaggerated character traits until that's all a character became known for. They contradicted points in the actual storyline, and they brought the pacing to a screeching halt. No, wait. Screeching implies something dangerous and possibly interesting. Charging up attacks or panning across mountains for half an episode and sitting through recaps that are several minutes long is the epitome of boring. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all for establishing a mood, for building suspense, for allowing a work time to breathe, but I don't think that anyone would argue that Goku and Frieza really needed to stare at each other quite that much. So that's why this segment exists, to cover some of the more major deviations that make Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z the TV series a different experience from Dragon Ball the manga. So if this is the first time you've been here and are expecting an analysis of the Dragon Ball storyline, that's not going to be covered here. I've already covered this story arc, I've neither the time or interest to repeat myself, and this video assumes you are already familiar with those videos or at least the manga version of this arc. If you did wander here by mistake, please check out these videos first, and I hope you find them informative and enjoyable enough that I'll see you back here when you finish. Anyway, on to the television. In an overall sense, the first story arc of Dragon Ball was adapted very well. It really doesn't have any of the pacing problems that the Z era will, and I find its original content to be humorous and very well integrated. Part of this, though, is because Toei really didn't seem to be worrying at this point about catching up to the manga. The core storyline is adapted with a refreshing briskness, which, and I can't believe I'm saying this, almost seems reckless in retrospect. There isn't even an episode recap at all until episode 11, and even then they continue to be sporadic for a while. But you can't really blame them. They had no idea how long this series was going to last, and every comment on the subject Toriyama was making at the time seemed to imply it wouldn't be very long. And with the manga having over a year's head start on the anime, the TV series began right after Goku beat Murasaki, what reason did they have to think they'd ever catch up? So on one hand, I want to praise it for being a solid adaptation, but looking at the bigger picture, part of me wonders if maybe they'd slowed it down just a little bit more, things wouldn't have gotten so abysmal later on. Now, while I've chosen to call the first story arc the Hunt for the Dragon Balls arc, it's fairly common to see this section of the story referred to by fans as the Pilaf Saga or something along those lines. Now, if you go by the manga, it's a fairly puzzling designation. Sure, Pilaf serves as the final boss and the biggest challenge our heroes face, but he only shows up at the end and has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the hunt. However, when I was a kid and had only seen the TV version of this, the Pilaf Saga seemed like a perfectly logical choice. It's funny, you remember how I once said that on epic quests you can introduce villains in two ways? That one was having a series of disconnected threats germane to the specific locations, like this arc, and the other was having a central villain or villainous organization, like with the Red Ribbon Army arc. Well, the TV series actually did something of an about-face when it came to this idea. Apparently, they wanted an overall villain because Pilaf and crew show up in nearly every episode of this arc. And as I mentioned before, this is where the names Shu and Mai come from. Since they were going to be such important characters, the TV staff wanted them to have names, and they and Toriyama apparently forgot that the Ninja Fox guy was already named Soba, and so these names were eventually reworked into the manga. But the Pilaf contribution is by far the biggest change to this story. Yet the TV writers didn't really change much of the established story to make it work. They still largely don't interact with the heroes at all until their originally established time. Instead, they're sort of working behind the scenes, usually one step behind of whatever Goku and the others are trying to do. Looking at it while being familiar with the manga, it's pretty easy to see how careful the staff was being with this, but if you had no idea, nothing really seems out of place. In fact, I think they were very creative in merging these two concepts together. In the first episode, we see Pilaf, Shu, and Mai collect their first Dragon Ball, and Mai even takes some of Bluma's Dragon Ball exposition. Granted, that begs the question of why Pilaf would need to be told about this after he's already collected his first ball. In the second episode, Goku's quest for dinner is expanded from a one-note joke about grossing out Bluma into something we actually see. For some reason, Shu and Mai are led to believe that there's a Dragon Ball in the forest where Goku and Bluma are camping out. It turns out to be wolves, and Goku, who believes the two henchmen are there to steal his dinner, takes them out, and we get to see where Goku's dinner that night came from. A more accurate intelligence report sends Pilaf and crew to Kame House, but while Kame sending in his Dragon Ball are out meeting Goku and Bluma for the first time. There are actually some pretty good gags here, like Pilaf's feeble attempt at lockpicking, but I don't think anyone can argue that the highlight is Pilaf pulling a switchblade on a lounging crocodile we never see again. Ultimately, Kame Sennin catches them in the act and helps them leave by knocking a hole in their boat. Interestingly, this scene means that Kame House appears in the TV series much earlier than it does in the manga. Finally, what I think is their absolute best effort at incorporating the Pilaf elements is when the gang has set up camp in the desert. Not far away, Shu and Mai have programmed a bomb they plan to stick to the bottom of Oolong's camper. However, Shu ends up sticking it to his hand by mistake after it's already activated. During the course of the night, while having to avoid Yamcha and Puar's zany antics, they manage to get it off his hand and finally put it on the trailer. The next morning, when Yamcha blows up the camper, Shu and Mai assume it was their bomb and go and check the abandoned wreckage for the Dragon Balls, only for their bomb to blow up right in their faces. This is just perfect. Their plot integrates seamlessly into what Toriyama had already written and adds an extra layer of complications to this hilarious comedy of errors scenario. Once Pilaf and company make their real appearances, though, the climax of the arc has quite a few additions. The most bizarre occurs after Pilaf gasses the gang in order to knock them out and steal their last Dragon Ball. Upon waking up, they notice that their captors failed to close the wall back on them, so they escape, and upon being discovered are thrown into a giant musical-powered pinball game complete with a huge ball that follows them all around the castle until it herds them back into their prison. Weird. Pointless. But funny. After Goku transforms, Yamcha's given a bit more of an explicit resolution to his character arc, which I liked. As they're escaping, Bluma twists her ankle and can't run away. Now she needs help, but Yamcha still can't get near her. With Oolong yelling at him to give a hand, Yamcha finally has to suck it up and carries them all to safety. Afterwards, he realizes that he touched a girl and was just fine. As for Pilaf and the others, rather than just getting knocked out of the sky as they try to get away, the TV series makes them more responsible for their own defeat. They actually manage to get away until Pilaf finds himself overcome with rage over the loss of his castle and insists they turn around and attack the monster. They even manage to knock him out with a missile. But even that's not enough, so they land the plane and Pilaf actually starts kicking and jumping on him, which wakes Goku up. And it's only when they try to escape again that the monster Goku smacks them around. But even then, Pilaf doesn't give up. Once Goku is subdued, he tries to convince Shu and Mai that what they really need to do is take up pistols and pick them all off. When Pilaf shows he's not willing to join them himself, that's when they run off for good. As for that subduing of Goku, the stakes are raised quite a bit. Goku actually holds Bluma in his hand and tries to eat her, a device that would later be reused with Lunch in the second movie, and rather than just Yamcha grabbing the tail, it requires the combined powers of Yamcha, Oolong, and Puar to pacify Goku. Perhaps surprisingly, a few of the more comic book-like fourth wall breaking elements of the first arc were removed for the TV series. When Goku gets his classic hit in on Yamcha, Yamcha obviously does not break the panel since there is no panel, he just smashes into some rocks. Not nearly as memorable in my opinion. When Mai makes her balls joke, Pilaf does not go into a tirade about how this manga is different from Dr. Slump. Instead, he simply says he hates crude jokes. And there's certainly no poop on a stick this time around. Yet for some reason the Toriyama robot at the beach is retained and he still references Penguin Village. And finally, there are just a couple of miscellaneous things that interested me. There's a minor but very odd change. The sunglasses-wearing rabbit they encounter is known as Toninjinka in the manga, but for some reason in the anime his name is changed to Usagi Ninjinka. They both mean the same thing, but it's surprising that such a misreading of the original furigana occurred. Also, if you happen to enjoy all those bare-breasted shots of Bluma in the manga, you'll find the TV series doesn't quite provide the same underage experience, as it usually finds ways to obscure her chest-butt. That said, her butt-butt is apparently considered just fine. And in that same scene, Bluma's humming the ending credits song. Since we're on the subject of the adaptation of Dragon Ball, there are other production-related topics that a manga simply does not possess. And I'd like to briefly touch on a few of them as we go along. So in this installment, I'll begin by mentioning some of the differing animation studios that handle Dragon Ball. It should go without saying that the artwork in the TV version is not Toriyama's, and that there are a ton more drawings to crank out in a piece of animation than in a comic. To that end, Dragon Ball began with 6 main animation teams, each taking turns from episode to episode. I admit that animation isn't exactly my specialty. You should talk to my friend Jacob YBM for a really in-depth discussion on the matter, but since I collected the Z Dragon boxes and watched everything through with an adult eye, I began to recognize the different art styles and form my own opinions on them. The first I'll mention is Studio Junio, supervised by Maeda Minoru, the chief animator and character designer for the series. As such, his work is usually some of the highest quality, and his episodes are among my favorites. It's highly detailed throughout, and heavily resembles Toriyama's artwork. I do think there are some points during the 23rd Budokai where his work starts to suffer. In particular, his shading really starts to look rough around that point. But once Z rolled around, he was really back on his A-game. Sadly, around the Frieza arc, his episodes became rarer and rarer, presumably because he was so busy with all the Z movies that were being cranked out. During the Cell arc, though, he left Dragon Ball, leaving even more episodes to be covered by our next studio. When I was first introduced to Last House, I considered it to be Maeda Light. I like Last House's work at this point in the series a lot. It's not nearly as detailed as Studio Junio, but there's a cute roundness to it that, when it's at its best, endears itself to me. Uchiyama Masayuki supervised, and as the series went on, he had to take on more and more duties himself, and we'll be stopping in from time to see just how Last House progresses. Well, I feel I've gone on long enough, so yes, that's the first story arc of Dragon Ball redone for television. There's definitely some fluff here, but it's well done fluff. None of it is really bad, and some of it does manage to help the story. Toei's Dragon Ball is off to a good start. But moving right along, next time we'll take a look at the second television arc as we revisit the 21st Tenkaichi Budokai. See you there!